Good afternoon. My name is Rabbi Chaim Dov Beliak. I'm pleased to welcome you to another one in our series of Freighted Legacies. This is a series of programs that discusses Jewish history, culture, in the context of the Polish experience of Jewish life, both contemporary and historical. Today we're focusing on history. This is the week of Holocaust commemoration, Yom HaShoah, and it's most appropriate and wonderful that we will have as our guest Dr. Sam Kassow. I want to call your attention first to some housekeeping details. If you're listening to this program, I invite you to find the globe at the bottom of your screen and choose the language you prefer to hear. It's being broadcast now in Polish and in English. If you're more comfortable in Polish, choose Polish. If you're more comfortable in English, choose English. The series of Freighted Legacies has been an opportunity for us to learn uh, different aspects of history. And today we are blessed by the fact that Dr. Sam Kassow is sharing with us the recent product of his scholarship, a translation of Rokhl Auerbach's Warsaw Testament. Um, I want to add that this is a translation from Yiddish, but to be honest with you, even if you knew the English, you would not be able to read this book with the ease and the clarity that Dr. Kossow has added in the very careful notes and things that he provides as a guide for the reader. This is a profound book. I will allow the translator to frame for us the importance of the book, but I want everyone to appreciate that this is uh, an unusual legacy from the Ringelblum archive. Um, I just want to, before I invite Dr. Kossow to speak and to shape this, thank him. It is a book that actually has been significant to a number of us who are reading the book in the context of the current political situation. Um, and it has been both a comfort in a strange way and an insight into dark times and how people respond. Dr. Kossow was born in a DP camp to the son of two survivors of the Holocaust in Stuttgart, Germany. Um, he emigrated with his parents as a child, as a baby, from Germany to New Haven, Connecticut, um, and grew up in New Haven. Uh, Received his degrees from Trinity College, his BA, and a degree from the London School of Economics, master's degree, and his PhD from Princeton. Prior to this book, one of the most important of his books, I think it is properly described as his magnum opus, was the book Who Will Write Our History, colon, Emmanuel Ringelblum, and the Ghetto Archive. And this book that we are going to hear about is a part of that archive. Uh, a documentary was made um, recently about the book and the archive that carries the same title. And I highly recommend the book and the documentary for interested readers. This is uh, a profound contribution. At this time, I'd like to thank Dr. Kassow for joining us and to turn the microphone and invite your attention. You'll be able to add questions either in chat or the Q&A. And welcome, Dr. Kassow.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Well, I want to thank Rabbi Biliak and for giving me the opportunity to speak in this series of lectures devoted to the freighted legacies. And I'm especially happy to have a chance to talk to a Polish audience. And I'm talking today about a largely forgotten woman, largely forgotten until recently, Rokhl Auerbach, who dedicated her whole life to preserving the memory of the Holocaust. Uh, Her life reflected the tensions and the ruptures of East European Jewry in the 20th century, a childhood spent in a remote rural village in the foothills of the Carpathians, now part of Ukraine. Uh, Partaking in the rich multi-ethnic urban culture of interwar Lvov, where she was a student in the Jan Kazimierz University, and where she became very familiar with Polish high culture and befriended Bruno Schulz and Dvor Vogel. She then moved to Warsaw, where she became part of the fractious and intense Yiddish literary world of the 1930s, and for a time was the partner of the brilliant Yiddish poet Itzik Manger. And then in wartime, she was in the Ringelblum archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. With the help of Emmanuel Ringelblum, Auerbach left the Warsaw Ghetto in the nick of time in March 1943, just before the start of the ghetto uprising, with a fake Kenkarta, with a fake ID card, and with a new Polish name, Aniela Dobrucka. Auerbach became an intrepid courier for the Jewish underground. Day in and day out, she risked her life to deliver messages and money to Jews in hiding. And in the evening, she wrote. In post war Poland, she joined the Central Jewish Historical Commission and did pioneering historical research. After she left Poland for Israel in 1950, Auerbach started the Survivor Testimony Division at Yad VaShem, and she played an important behind the scenes role during the Eichmann trial, where she urged Gideon Hausner, the chief prosecutor, to put survivor testimony front and center. That is, instead of a narrow legal focus on Eichmann's particular activities in the Nazi bureaucracy, as Hannah Arendt would have preferred, Auerbach wanted a show trial with victim testimony front and center, a trial that would show Israelis and everyone else who cared to listen just what it meant to be a Jew under the Nazi occupation. And unlike the Nuremberg trial, where the Jewish issue was not at the top of the agenda, the Eichmann trial would conform to the needs and the agendas of the Jewish people. In the last years of her life, Auerbach reworked her wartime writings into memoirs of the Warsaw Ghetto. She managed to finish one volume, Warszawa, which was published in 1974. But she died in 1976 as she was writing the second, Beim letzten Weg. By the way, Warszawa means Warsaw Testament. Beim letzten Weg means the last road. It's those volumes that I translated into English, which have appeared as Warsaw Testament. I just want to add something else. During the war, she wrote most of these memoirs in the Polish language. She rewrote them in Yiddish in Israel after the war, and now I've translated them into English. I hope that's not too confusing. Among her wartime writings was a remarkable essay called Yiskar, Remember. She wrote that in November 1943. The ghetto was now just a heap of rubble. Its hundreds of thousands of Jews murdered. So on a dreary day in November, Auerbach was riding in a streetcar in Aryan Warsaw. By now, the Germans had ramped up their reign of terror against the Poles. Hardly a week went by without another mass shooting of Polish hostages in downtown Warsaw. And suddenly, a Polish woman sitting in the same streetcar started to weep. The Germans had just shot her son. My son, she cried over and over. And Auerbach thought to herself, I may never, I may neither groan nor weep. I may not draw attention to myself in the street. And I need to groan. I need to weep. Not 4 times a year. I need to say Yizkor 4 times a day. By the way, for those who don't know, the Yizkor prayer is a prayer said for dead relatives, and it's said 4 times a year at certain major Jewish holidays. So that night, Auerbach went back to her room on Smolna Street, and her landlady had no idea that she was harboring a Jew, and she began to write that essay. How do you say Yizkor? How do you say the memorial prayer for 500,000 Jews? And as she groped for images to explain the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe, she used the example of a flood. And I want to quote now directly from this essay. I saw a flood once in the mountains. Wooden huts, torn from their foundations, were carried above the raging waters. One could see lighted lamps in them, men, women, and children in cradles tied to ceiling beams. Other huts were empty inside, but one could see a tangle of arms waving from the roof like branches blowing in the wind, waving desperately toward heaven, toward the riverbanks for help. At a distance, one could see mouths gaping, but one could not hear the cries because the roar of the waters drowned out everything. And that's how the Jewish masses flowed to their destruction at the time of the deportations, sinking as helplessly into the deluge of destruction. Now, why did she begin with the image of a natural disaster, of a flood? I think that as she wrote, she could guess what certain people who were not there, might ask after the war. Questions like, what had happened to those millions of Polish Jews? Why had they let themselves be fooled? Those tough, bright, resourceful Jews, why didn't they resist? Now, by using the imagery of a flood, a tsunami, of a natural disaster, as David Roskies once pointed out, Auerbach anticipated those questions. Can you criticize the reactions of people swept away in a sudden flood? Of course, the Holocaust was not a meta-historical event. It was part of history. It had to be studied in detail. But its enormity was too horrible and too unprecedented to allow for glib theories and facile questions that might compromise the memory of the Jewish masses that she cherished so deeply. And in that same essay, she added these words. And if for even one of the days of my life I should forget how I saw you then, my people, desperate and confused, delivered over to extinction, may all knowledge of me be forgotten. May my name be cursed, like that of those traitors who are unworthy to share your pain. Auerbach never broke that vow, and for the rest of her life, she lived only to make sure that people remembered. Nobody told the story of the Warsaw Ghetto with as much passion and insight. Few worked more diligently to persuade historians, lawyers, and the wider public to listen, really listen to the testimony of survivors and to remember not just the famous names, but also the ordinary people who went to their deaths. At a time when the Warsaw Ghetto uprising emerged as the symbol of Jewish resistance and heroism during the Holocaust, it was Auerbach who reminded Jews to remember the writers and the poets along with the fighters, to respect other kinds of resistance, self-help, smuggling, helping one's neighbors, to fight back against depression and despair, other kinds of resistance besides armed resistance. And also, she asked people to ponder not just the trauma of mass murder, but also the deep wound of cultural genocide, because the Germans had committed a double murder, the physical destruction of the Jews, but also the erasure of their Yiddish speech and cultural legacy. What the French scholar Annette Viviorca called the era of the witness came about in no small measure thanks to the unstinting efforts of people like Rokhl Auerbach to highlight the importance of survivor testimony, the Eichmann trial being a key example. At a time when scholars like Raoul Hilberg were saying that documents were better sources than survivor accounts, Auerbach countered that yes, documents were well and good, but they were a source that usually had more to say about the perpetrators, who were more likely to produce them, than about the victims. And anticipating the work of Charles Friedlander and Jan Thomas Gross, Auerbach urged scholars and jurors to hear out these witnesses, to really listen to what they had to say. And as she crafted guidelines for conducting interviews at Yad VaShem, she pointed out that the nuances of body language and affect were often as significant as actual content. And so what if survivors got some dates and names wrong? Their authority of witnesses far outweighed whatever mistakes they might make. As one of only 3 survivors of Ringelblum's Oneg Shabbat archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, of the 60 people that Ringelblum brought into the archive, only 3 survived. Rokhl Auerbach had the rare opportunity not only to retrieve her wartime writings that had been buried in the archive in the Warsaw Zoo and in the Mokotów fields of South Warsaw, not just to retrieve those wartime writings, but to rewrite them after the war. When the Germans began the mass murder of Warsaw Jewry on July 22nd, 1942, Emmanuel Ringelblum called an emergency meeting of the Oneg Shabbat staff. And he ordered everyone to hand in what they were writing, finished or not. There was no time to lose. The Germans, with the help of the Jewish police, were deporting up to 7,000 Jews a day. And all the documents that were collected at the end of July were buried on August 3rd, 1942, under Novolipki 68, and they surfaced in the first cache of the archive that was discovered in September 1946. On July 26, Auerbach handed over her ghetto writings to Ringelblum's assistant, Eliyahu Gutkovsky. And as she handed those writings over, she attached a note full of raw fear, violent anger, and despair. I am handing over this unfinished essay to the archive. The 5th day of the deportation. Perhaps such horrors have already occurred before in Jewish history, but such shame, never. Jews as tools, as servants of the killers, this has never happened. I want to stay alive. I'm ready to kiss the boots of the worst scoundrel just to be able to see the moment of revenge. Revenge, revenge. Remember. By the way, I want to make a slight digression here, which is that a note like this underscores a major difference between writings of Jews during the war and post-war writings of survivors. Real wartime writings, like this note of Auerbach's that I just quoted, were full of anger against other Jews and were also full of calls for revenge. Post war writings tended, of course, to subsume all the victims as the 6 million martyrs, and that theme of anger and those calls for revenge was tamped down. Now, continuing, in that same note, Auerbach also wondered whether her writings would share the same fate as, say, the scribblings of a coal miner trapped in a mining accident with no survivors, whose body would never be found. And if by chance her writings surfaced, would anybody care to read them? And if she survived, what good would she be to anybody? Now, fast forward 2 years. It's now early 1944. She's now on the Aryan side with false papers. Now, Auerbach no longer had any doubts. She had to write. That was a debt that she owed to the dead, but she also had to be careful. The mass murder, the murder of millions of Jews by the Germans, that's a fact that speaks for itself. It is very dangerous to add to this subject interpretations or analyses. Anything that one writes now can quickly turn into hopeless hysteria or endless sobs. So one must approach this subject with the greatest caution in a restrained and factual manner. This had been my intention, not to express, but to transmit, to note only facts, but not to interpret. But she quickly added that this mandate to simply be objective and to transmit facts, not emotions, this mandate was impossible even for herself. After the war, in Poland and in Israel, after Auerbach had recovered her wartime manuscripts, her writing would take on yet another purpose, that is, to ensure that the Jewish people remember, not only to keep faith with the dead, but also to use the lessons of the Holocaust to strengthen the Jewish people and to tighten the bonds between Israel and the diaspora. Auerbach left Poland for Israel in 1950, and while she had many difficulties in her new home, she never wavered in her conviction that after the Holocaust, Israel had become the vital center of the Jewish people. And let me add, those who erroneously see some contradiction between devotion to Yiddish and Zionism should consider the example of Rokhl Auerbach, of the poet Avram Sutzkever, of the writer Leib Rochman, and many, many others. Like all good reportage, Auerbach's post-war books conveyed what she saw and observed in evocative, powerful language that made her writings an indispensable source for the cultural and social history of the Warsaw Ghetto. For Auerbach, the first step was to describe just what the Jewish people lost when the Germans destroyed Jewish Warsaw. Just after the war, Auerbach's friend Leo Finkelstein wrote in Das damalige Jiddische Warschau, the old Jewish Warsaw, that Warsaw's strength derived not from Zechus Ovis, but from Zechus Otzma, not from its historical traditions like Vilna or Krakow, but from its sheer mass and power. Warsaw, he believed, with 400,000 Jews, had no encrusted traditions, and thus it could serve as a pathbreaker in the modernization of Jewish life. When Finkelstein wrote about Warsaw, he wrote about the huge crowds, the masses of Jews who came to Peretz's funeral in 1915, the tens of thousands who came to the Bund's May Day demonstrations, the tens of thousands of Hasidim who came to greet the Gerer Rebbe at the Warsaw Railroad Station. Melech Ravitch, the Yiddish poet who had been one of Auerbach's key mentors and closest friends, had once called Warsaw a sprawling a mosaic of different Jewish tribes and subcultures, Hasidim, Polish-speaking doctors and lawyers, Litvaks, Bundes workers, and many, many others. Auerbach took the shattered bits and shards uh, of this mosaic and reconstructed a mosaic of memory based on a poignant evocation of dozens of individual vignettes. And thus she spoke for those who had no one to remember them. The ordinary Jews she she had come to know in the ghetto as she ran the soup kitchen on Leshno 40, as well as the Jewish writers, artists, and actors whose milieu she shared in the 1930s and in the ghetto. She believed that the more one knew about what and whom the Germans murdered, the more one could grasp the enormity of the national churban, of the national catastrophe. Much of Warsaw Testament includes Auerbach's wartime and post-war descriptions of the Warsaw Jewish intelligentsia. Writers like Kalman Lis, who had worked with children with special needs, actresses like Miriam Orlewska, who played Leah in the landmark Vilna Trupa production of The Dibuk, sculptors like Avram Osjega, who designed Peretz's tomb, and painters like Roman Kramstik, choirs, composers and choir directors such as David Eisenstadt, singers such as Eisenstadt's 17-year-old daughter Marisha, who Jews called the nightingale of the ghetto, and who was shot in cold blood as she was boarding the death train to Treblinka. Auerbach described Shia Broide, her boss in the Alleinhilfe, in the Samopomats, the self-help, who had translated Plato's dialogues into Yiddish. Yankov Gerstein, who'd composed a cantata based on the poetry of Mani Leib, the religious poet Yisrael Stern, who wrote his best poetry, Auerbach believed, just months before his death, Rosa Simkovich, a saintly pedagogue who had dedicated her life to helping the poor kids who went to the Yiddish secular schools, Leib Shur, a bibliophile who collected abandoned Yiddish books in the ghetto and who hanged himself in his library rather than go to the Umschlagplatz. Basha Berman, who started a children's library where kids could come in, borrow books, and listen to stories about faraway places that promised a better world after the war. There was the 11-year-old Yosima, a musical prodigy who played Mozart's 25th Piano Concerto in the ghetto, after which the musicians in the orchestra lifted her up as the audience applauded and applauded. If only this play had survived, that cantata, that poem, what Auerbach heard in the ghetto represented a flowering of Jewish genius, in her words, a bright flame, as she put it, just before the final destruction. As Auerbach traced the broad reach of Yiddish culture, which embraced music and the arts as well as literature, she underscored the depth of a German murder machine that destroyed a language and a culture along with the people. As soon as the war ended, Auerbach resolved to carry on Ringelblum's legacy, to find the tin boxes and milk cans buried under the trackless rubble of what had been the Warsaw Ghetto. The Yiddish writer Mendel Bahn recalled Auerbach's talk at the third anniversary commemoration of the Ghetto Uprising in 1946. After many tiresome speeches full of political posturing, Auerbach, the only woman on the podium, got up to speak. And I quote Mann, she did not make any speeches. She did not explain the meaning of the uprising. She implored, with a stubbornness that deeply affected me, she demanded, remember, she cried out, there is a national treasure under the ruins. Even if there are 5 stories of ruins, we have to find the archive. I'm not making this up. I know what I'm talking about. This is coming from my heart. I will not rest. I will not let you rest. We must rescue the Ringelblum archive. Auerbach reminded Jews of the model of Ringelblum's Oneg Shabbat archive, where she felt a shared sense of national mission had trumped political differences. Ringelblum brought together religious and secular Jews, Bundists, Zionists, and communists, the famous and the not so famous, men and women, in a common mission to collect and bury documents. Ringelblum's teacher, Isaac Schipper, said to a fellow inmate in Majdanek just before he was murdered that what we know about murdered peoples is what their killers choose to say about them. The Germans thought they would win the war, and they would determine how the Jews would be remembered, if at all. But in an amazing act of spiritual resistance, Ringelblum said, no, posterity will remember us on the basis of Jewish and not on German documents. Those time capsules will surface someday, even if we don't live to see it ourselves. And then the murdered Polish Jews will be remembered not as the faceless masks of victims, but as individuals with names, with identities, individuals who were part of a resilient Jewish community with hopes, dreams, and agency. By the way, imagine if the archive had never been found. How could there have been any real scholarship about the inner life of the Warsaw Ghetto? The books of Basha Engelking, Jacek Liocek, Havi Dreyfus, Yisroel Gutman, these books could not have been written without the documents of the archive. Ringelblum also called on his fellow members of the archive not to pull punches, to be objective, and to write about the collaborators as well as about the heroes. Auerbach took that message to heart after the war. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, she believed that for the Jewish people to recover, it had to take a hard, unvarnished view of what had happened during the war. It had to learn from failures and mistakes. It had to examine the bad as well as the good. It was all too easy to bask in the legend of armed resistance and gloss over everything else. Auerbach hallowed the exploits of the ghetto fighters and the partisans, but she did not want their story to overshadow and diminish the memory of the 99% who had no weapons, of ordinary Jews who did what they could to maintain their dignity, help their families, and who, lacking money, contacts on the Aryan side, knowledge of the Polish language, and even the ability to imagine the worst, were swept away in the torrent of death. Auerbach's work followed in the footsteps not only of Emmanuel Ringelblum, but also of YIVO director Max Weinreich, who had made special efforts to incorporate the insights of Sigmund Freud and social psychology into the study of Polish Jewry. In the highly politicized and divided world of interwar Polish Jewry, where so many stress the primacy of the collective and of ideologies over the individual, Max Weinreich, in his youth studies project, for instance, argued that one could not understand the Jewish collective, Klal Yisrael, without grasping the needs of the Jewish individual, Reb Yisrael, the aspirations, the drives, the obsessions, the hopes of the many individuals who made up the many million Jewish mass in Poland. Indeed, unlike many other writers and memoirists of the Churban, of the catastrophe, Auerbach focused not so much on recording facts and events as on evoking a socio-psychological study of Warsaw Jewry on the brink of the abyss. Before the war, Auerbach had studied social psychology at the Jan Kazimierz University in Lvov and had come to know many of the Polish experts in the field. In her wartime and post-war writings, she delved into the complex interplay of psychological factors in individuals, families, and entire social groups. How does a community, how do individuals react to a slowly unfolding catastrophe? a disaster that began in 1939 and progressed in stages: economic ruin, armbands, beatings, a ghetto, disease, hunger, and then mass deportation, which the Germans skillfully camouflaged at first as a mere culling of unproductive elements. How do people experience time? How do they try to shield themselves from the awful truth, rumors, false hopes, illusions? How do they shield themselves from those? Auerbach told a complicated story: resilience, vitality, and self sacrifice on the one hand, corruption and moral collapse on the other. She stressed the Germans' skillful use of psychological factors to effect the destruction of Warsaw Jewry and to use the Jews' strengths against them. The Germans played with the Jews. They played with their natural human instincts of hope, of self preservation. In her brilliant observations of the mass hysteria that gripped the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942, Auerbach described how the very qualities that had served Jews so well in the past, practicality, pragmatism, hard-headedness, Jewish common sense, seichel in Yiddish, Jewish natural optimism, that all those qualities now indeed have the opposite effect, and it accelerated their journey into the abyss. Auerbach was a superb observer of the Jewish everyday. She had a fine sense of the nuances and of the behavior and speech of different classes of Polish Jews, whether they lived in small towns or in urban centers like Warsaw. As I said, she had grown up in a remote village, not a shtetl, Lanowitz in Podolia, where she acquired a love of Jewish folklore and the Yiddish language. But Lanowitz also gave her a chance to befriend her Polish and Ukrainian neighbors. As a child, she played with Polish and Ukrainian children. That immersion in her non-Jewish surroundings, she believed, helped her survive later on. And I quote, "How did I survive on the Aryan side when hundreds of other Jews perished? It certainly was not because I was smarter. What helped me were my early years growing up in a village. Those close ties with non-Jews left a mark on my personality. What rubbed off on me was that rural Slavic temperament. And that, of course, helped her to pretend she was a Polish woman during the war." One of the more striking features of Auerbach's writings of this period is her portrayal of Poland and the Poles. As a courier who distributed money and aid to hidden Jews, Auerbach was in constant contact with a category, very small in number, of Poles who most Jews in the war never had a chance to meet: the liberal intellectual elite, who often risked their lives to help Jews. Her descriptions of such individuals as Jan Żabiński and his wife are particularly instructive and insightful. Żabiński had been the director of the Warsaw Zoo, as well as an officer in the Armia Krajowa. During the war, he and his wife helped many Jews, including Auerbach herself. And her intense devotion to the memory of Jewish Warsaw in no way diminished her deep empathy for Polish Warsaw and for its sufferings. Unlike Jewish diarists like Chaim Kaplan, who mocked what he called the stupidity of the Polish generals when they refused to surrender Warsaw and avoid massive civilian casualties, Auerbach praised Polish courage and patriotism. And I quote, "Romanticism, idealism, let the naysayers have the contempt they deserve. Other European peoples did not fight, but we Polish Jews understood what the Poles did. We were at their side, and we understand today." At the end of 1939, after Warsaw capitulated, Auerbach was about to flee to Lvov when she received an unexpected summons from Emmanuel Ringelblum to stay in Warsaw and to run a soup kitchen. Most of the Jewish elites had run away, but Ringelblum reminded Auerbach that not everyone had the right to flee. Someone had to stay behind and help the community. A year in 1941, Ringelblum recruited Auerbach to the Oneg Shabbat archive by asking her to write an essay about her soup kitchen. As Auerbach would stress after the war, had it not been for Ringelblum, she would not have written anything. Auerbach's soup kitchen on Leshno 40, which fed 2,000 Jews a day, offered her a unique vantage point to get to know and observe a large number of eaters. And the story that Auerbach told provided a gripping behind the scenes look at the desperate battle that the ghetto was fighting against hunger. Auerbach invested the social history of hunger by telling the story of a soup kitchen as a microcosm of human relationships and human choices. The dead who ended up in the pits of the Gensha cemetery were not an undifferentiated mass, but individuals whose idiosyncrasies Auerbach recorded. And it seemed to her then as if the kitchen only prolonged the agony, but really saved no one. And just a digression, the kitchen gave people about 600 or 700 calories a day. If one only had the kitchen as one source of food, one would often starve within 3 or 4 months. The question was, should she favor a chosen few or should she dole out equal rations and save no one? Ringelblum asked the same question. And I just want to quote this sketch from Auerbach's essay about the soup kitchen, one of many sketches. I remember the Kobrinner family, 3 sisters who managed to rescue a fine aluminum pot from what once had been a home and a life. In the early days, one of the sisters would come to get soup for all 3. Maybe the others were working somewhere. I didn't really know the family at first. About half a year later, a woman approached me. She had a chit and was carrying the pot. My sister is sick, she told me. That happened before they organized the ghetto. Our kitchen was serving about 500 to 600 soups a day that day. The woman who doled out the soup, Miss Helena, knew all the customers. She served them with a smile and a warm word. She knew about their lives and their troubles. She asked the new sister how the older one was doing. So it was. One sister took the other's place. A little later, Helena informed me that the third sister, was standing in the soup line. So now the second sister no longer had the strength to come. Only the pot remained as before, well cleaned and glistening brightly. That pot told volumes about a way of life, about a tiny home, about the dignified decline of yet one more Jewish family. In a diary entry of August 4th, 1941, she noted, "What is the use of all our work if we can't save even one person from death by hunger?" Ringelblum gave her new assignments. In September 1942, Ringelblum asked her to interview Avram Kshepitsky, who had escaped from Treblinka, and the interview resulted in a protocol of more than 100 pages. Kshepitsky did not survive, but after the war, Auerbach developed a special bond with the Treblinka survivors, about whom she wrote in the late 1940s, and whose honor she defended in the 1960s during the controversy about Steiner's book on the Treblinka uprising. In February 1933, as I said, in February 1943, Auerbach escaped to the Aryan side. There, after the ghetto uprising, she continued to write for what she called the continuation archive, the continuation of the Oneg Shabbat archive on the Aryan side. With the help of Polish friends, she buried her writings in the zoo and in the Mokotov fields. Both caches survived, as I said. As Auerbach wrote, I had better luck in saving paper than in saving people. I had better luck in saving paper than in saving people. I want to conclude that most of the power of Auerbach's reportage stemmed from her rare and unique ability to navigate cultural boundaries. derived from a life that straddled different worlds: village, shtetl, and city, Yiddish and Polish, Poles and Jews and Ukrainians, Galicia and Warsaw, the milieu of the Jewish literary elite and the world of the Jewish masses, the world of the religious and the world of the secular, the world of diaspora nationalists and the world of Zionists. These qualities make her memoirs all the more important for an understanding of the Holocaust. Thank you very much for your attention. And now, if possible, I'd just like to show a few images, if possible. So these are two leaders of the Joint Distribution Committee in Warsaw in 1945. And this gives you an idea of the rubble, of the ruins of Warsaw after the bombing of September 1939, after the Jewish uprising of 1943, after the Polish uprising of 1944. It illustrates how difficult it was to even know where a street had been, much less a house had been. But with financial help from the Jewish Labor Committee, from the Joint, and using pre-war aerial photographs and using the spire of a church that was still standing, searchers were able to guess where Novolipki 68 had been and began to organize the search, which resulted in the finding of the first cache of the archive. Okay, next image. This is in September 1946, where the searchers have found the first cache of the archive, 10 tin boxes. More was buried in August 1942, and unfortunately, a lot of water had seeped into the boxes, so there was a great deal of damage. The only person who knew where the archive had actually been buried was Hirschwasser, with his back to the camera, one of the only three survivors of the archive. He survived by a very narrow margin, once jumping from a train, taking him to Treblinka. The man in the mustache is the historian Michal Borovich, who also survived by a thin margin, once being hanged in the Janowska labor camp in Lvov, but the rope broke. And the German commandant, being a gentleman, let him go back into the camp from which he later escaped. Okay, next slide. This is Hirschwasser opening one of the tin cans, one of the tin boxes. Next slide. So the second cache of the archive was found by Polish construction workers in December 1950. The second cache was buried in December, in the end of February 1943. It was buried in two milk cans. The milk cans protected the documents a lot better. So these are the two caches, the first cache in the tin boxes, the second cache in the aluminum milk cans. Next slide. This is Emmanuel Ringelblum as a young man, I think as a student in Warsaw University. Next slide. Okay, this is an interesting picture. This is taken at the YIVO conference in Vilna in 1935. In many ways, the Oneg Shabbat archive was a continuation of the work of the YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, which was founded in Vilna in 1925, and whose mission was to bring scholars and ordinary Jews together in a project to document and study Jewish life as it was, to concentrate on the history of the Jewish people and not just the history of Jewish elites, to integrate the insights of psychology, social history, folklore, economics, history into the study of Jews. Auerbach was active in the YIVO. Ringelblum was active in the YIVO. And in this picture from the left, we see Emmanuel Ringelblum, and then going left in dressed in black, Itzik Manger, the great Yiddish poet who was also emotionally rather unstable, especially when he used alcohol, which was often. He was Auerbach's partner in the 1930s. Then we see Auerbach. Then we see Jacob Schatzky, who lived in the United States. He wrote The Great History of the Jews of Warsaw, and he founded the American branch of the YIVO. Second from the right is Rokhl Mahler, who was Ringelblum's close friend, went to the United States in 1938 and became a very important Marxist Jewish historian. Okay, next slide. This is Ringelblum, his wife Judita, and their son Yuri uh, uh, as a little baby. Next slide. Ringelblum and his son Yuri. Uh, as you know, they were both murdered in March 1944. There had been an attempt by inmates of the Paviak prison to perhaps save Ringelblum's life by taking him from the one cell into another. The Yiddish journalist Yechiel Hirschout, who survived the war, went into Ringelblum's cell, and Ringelblum had been badly beaten. This was just a couple days after he and the other Jews in the bunker on Grietska had been discovered. And he'd been badly beaten, and Yuri was sitting on his lap. And he outlined this scheme, and Ringelblum said he could not leave his wife and son. And the last words that Hirschout remembers Ringelblum saying, these were words in Yiddish, pointing to his son, he was saying, "Was ist schuldig, der Kleiner, zu liebem wirklich nur stark das Herz?" Why is this little one guilty? What has he done? Because of him, my heart is really breaking. Okay, next slide. This is Judita, sorry, this is Gela Sexton and her daughter Margalit. Gela Sexton, along with Israel Lichtenstein, her husband, and David Graeber and Nahum Agzivach, they left their last wills and testament in the first cache of the archive, which they helped bury in August 1942. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the last slide that I'm going to show. This is just an example of one of the 70 photographs that survived in the Oneg Shabbat archive. There were many more photographs, but they were ruined by the water seepage. The Germans used the camera. The Germans used the film camera to make anti-Jewish propaganda, to show Jews in the most humiliating situations. And the Oneg Shabbat tried to use the camera to show Jewish agency, to show Jewish resistance. And one of the major forms of Jewish resistance was the massive smuggling that of necessity had to involve Jews and Poles. The smuggling that comprised up to 90% of the calories consumed in the Warsaw Ghetto. If 80% of the Jews in the ghetto were still alive in July 1942, it was largely because of the smuggling that took place. Okay, that's it for the images. Thank you very much.
At this point, I'd like to invite questions. There are so many places that uh, you have opened up the story for us, the narrative for us to understand, and people are welcome to put their questions in Q&A. Questions are welcome in Polish. Dominika will help us to field those questions, and I'm going to put a question in the chat that I have, and I I know that this borders a little bit on the uh, uh, Rechilus level, but I think it demonstrates the tremendous determination of Rokhl Auerbach because of her insistence to take on the authorities in what was forming to be the Yad VaShem memorial after the state was founded. And I'm wondering if you could describe some of those issues that she was involved with.
Yeah, Rokhl Auerbach did not have an easy time at Yad Vashem, and in the 1950s, she was involved in a rather nasty controversy with the head of Yad Vashem, the great Zionist historian Ben-Zion Dinur. Now, this controversy was about the aims and goals of Yad Vashem and about how to study the Holocaust and the role of the Holocaust in Israeli public memory. Ben-Zion Dinur, as a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist, while he, of course, like all Jews, were shocked and shattered by the news of the Holocaust, he believed that, in a way, the Holocaust itself, in and of itself, was no great surprise. That the disaster that would befall diaspora Jewry was predicted by the Zionist movement. And therefore, he believed that the Yad Vashem should focus on an academic study of the destroyed Jewish communities, their pre-war history. He wanted to put out a Pinkas HaKehilot, an encyclopedia of Jewish communities. And what actually happened in the Holocaust, which is what most concerned Auerbach, what I would call the phenomenology of of the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, the fear, the terror, the suffering, the indescribable emotional distress of parents who saw their children die and children who saw their parents die, what happened in the death trains going to the death camps. For for Dinur, this was not the kind of material that Yad Vashem should be uh, prioritizing. Furthermore, he believed that Auerbach and many of her fellow survivors who worked at Yad Vashem were not really trained academics. They didn't have the PhDs from major universities. They were too emotional. They were too affected by their experience. Also, I think it's not unfair to say that Auerbach, of course, suffered her whole life from misogyny. The fact that she was a woman led to many barbs and sarcastic comments before the war. Being Monger's partner, many Yiddish writers refer to Auerbach as die literarische Beilage, the literary supplement, Monger's sidekick. When she was editor of the Yiddish journal Zusteier in Lvov, trying to develop support for Yiddish among the Galician Jewish intelligentsia, she and Dvorah Fogel were often sniped at, and for being women. And at Yad Vashem, this didn't help. And also, it didn't help that in Israel, to get along in Israel, especially at that time, you needed protexia. You needed to be close to a political machine or to a protector. And Auerbach was never part of a political movement. And so she had no one to protect her. So to answer your question, Dinur fired her. But then there was a public outcry from survivors. And Auerbach was reinstated and Dinur resigned. But Auerbach, while she continued at Yad Vashem, she never had the support for her testimonies division that she thought she deserved. And one last thing I want to say about this. The Eichmann trial, which she had a role in the preparation of, turned out to be for her a shattering personal disappointment because she had been told in advance that she would have, I think, an hour and a half to testify. And she was looking forward to testifying about the other forms of resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Ringelblum archive, the soup kitchen, the self-help. She insisted on testifying in Hebrew which was not her first language and possibly a mistake. But here's what happened. The day of the testimony, they changed the order of the witnesses. And the two witnesses that preceded her were Yitzhak Zuckerman and his wife Tzivia Lubetkin, two great stars of the Jewish resistance and of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, they were a very hard act to follow. Auerbach begins to talk about the soup kitchens. The judges are visibly bored, and they cut her off after half an hour. And she feels that she had been personally insulted. She didn't get a chance to say what she wanted uh, to say. And not only that, but when Roberta Grossman and Nancy Spielberg were making the movie based on my book on the Ringelblum archive, they naturally wanted to use the video of Auerbach's testimony at the Eichmann trial. So guess what? It turned out to be lost. Or when Grossman looked for the video, they couldn't find it. So they had video of all the other witnesses, but somehow they didn't even bother to take a video of Auerbach's testimony, or they couldn't find it.
Thank you. I appreciate very much the response to that question. There's a question from Dr. David Cater, um, which I think you could see in the chat. It says, "Thank you for your remarkable, informative, and moving presentation. My question is, how much of the archives were found? How many are available in English?"
Okay, well, a lot of the archive was lost. According to Hirschwasser, there had been a third cache buried on the brushmaker's shop, which after the war became the site of the Chinese embassy in Poland on Świętojarskie 34. That cache was never found, although there are Polish scholars who would deny that Wasser was correct, but that's neither here nor there. To cut to the chase, although much was lost, we have about 35,000 usable documents. The Jewish Historical Institute has just finished a remarkable publication project. The whole archive has now been published in 36 volumes in Polish. Now, in the original archive, about 50% of the material was in Polish, 45% was in Yiddish, 5% in other languages. In the 36-volume publication, there is a CD-ROM at the back of each volume so you could see the scans of the originals. In English, the Jewish Historical Institute is publishing a 10-volume selection of key documents in English. This project is just about finished, and this will be a major resource for academics and for students.
Thank you. I hope that you will continue to work and present more of these materials in the unique way that you have uh, framed for us and helped us understand uh, the work of Rokhl Auerbach. Um, I want to just turn, first of all, before I thank you, to see if there are other questions that came to the fore. Um, Here we have just a word from one of the people listening. Extraordinary, thank you. So that is a way of thanking you with the word extraordinary. I urge people to read uh, the Warsaw Testament, and I also urge people to read Who Will Write Our History. I want to thank Dr. Kossow for this presentation today. I want to turn your attention for just a moment to the fact that on June 8th, we will be continuing in many ways to focus on the efforts of understanding the Jewish past and Jewish present. I'm putting up here the cover of a new book that has just been published and will be the topic of our discussion on June 8th, called Poles and Jews, A Call for Myth, Reconstruction. This is by an independent scholar, Jennifer Stark Blumenthal. It's the work of 20 years of dedication. And here we have a picture of her and description, which is available on our website. I will note that the corresponding responder will be Dr. Antony Polanski. This is part of a series that he has fostered, and it joins the question of the ongoing relationship between Jews and Poles. I think will be a very interesting and important um, conversation on June 8th. And we have on the website the introduction that we've been allowed to publish and the link to how one can buy the book, as well as a summary. I want to thank Dr. Kossow once again. I want to welcome people to support our work uh, and look forward to seeing you again on our Frigid Legacy program. I think it's very significant that we were able to share this work today uh, as we commemorate the Holocaust in one of its most significant ways, which is by understanding the lives of the people that were the victims and the understanding the situation of our people at that time and in our own time. Um, Many thanks. I want to conclude by just referring you to a new project that has associated itself with Friends of Jewish Renewal. That is Yiddish um, uh, schmoozers in English translation. And part of one of the conversations that we had when Dr. Kossow's book came out was an attempt to read the book, Warsaw Testament, but with an eye toward our contemporary situation. Historians may not think it is the most legitimate way of doing history, but it is certainly an important way of thinking about our contemporary situation. And we have a very extensive um, record of the conversation, and I invite you to uh, look at it on our website, www.jewishrenewalinpoland.org. Finally, I want to thank Dominika Zakarczewska, our interpreters Marzena Szymanska, and Marek Yazowski. And Marek, you're holding up a book for us to see. What is it? It is the same book in Polish? Thank you. I neglected to mention that, as Dr. Kassow mentioned, uh, much of the material that appears for us now in English was originally written in Polish and translated to Yiddish. And there is for our Polish readers, an opportunity to read the materials in Polish. Thank you very much, and have a good day.